Welcome back to Square Off. If you've been paying attention to politics for more than, say, 5 years, you know what we're seeing today is not politics as usual, even within the wide band that's defined politics for decades. So are we just seeing something new in an ever-evolving democracy, or, as many experts argue, something dangerous, a threat to our democracy? And how, as citizens and journalists, should we even know the difference? The nonprofit and nonpartisan organization Protect Democracy has produced the Authoritarian Playbook. It's a 28-page guide for journalists to understand what's going on in our politics, and it's just as useful for voters. Jennifer Dresden is a policy advocate at Protect Democracy and one of the authors of the playbook. She's published and lectured on democratic and authoritarian politics and done research in the U.S. and overseas. Welcome to Square Off.
Thanks so much for having me.
So the playbook says modern authoritarians, quote, use salami tactics, slicing away at democracy a sliver at a time. What are those slivers of democracy that they're slicing off?
Absolutely. So when we talk about salami tactics, there are 7 broad tactics that we see around the world that contemporary authoritarians use to take power. This doesn't happen overnight. This is not something that is a sudden event that happens in the course of a morning or an afternoon or a day. Instead, what we see is over time, the steady erosion of key parts of democracy, of democratic norms, of democratic institutions. And this ranges from things like corrupting elections, politicizing independent institutions, undermining checks and balances, aggrandizing executive power, all the way to things like stoking violence. So in the playbook, we talk about these 7 different tactics that around the world we see authoritarians using to take power one piece at a time over time.
And so I looked at those 7, I think I checked off 6 that were happening, including what's going on here in Arizona and around the country, where we have the top Republican statewide candidates, many of them Republicans, promoting the lie that the 2020 election was stolen from Donald Trump. Is that lie in itself a step toward authoritarianism?
Well, one of the things that we've seen around the world over the last 20, even 30 years is that authoritarians don't do away with elections. They still hold elections. But what they do is they undermine the free and fair nature of those elections. And one of the things that is important to recognize is that one of the first steps to being able to do that is to undermine public confidence in elections. That is one way of corrupting elections. And so in doing so, without a strong evidentiary basis, is certainly part of what we would consider a component of the playbook when we talk about corrupting elections.
And so here's a big concern when I mentioned politics as usual, is that this has become kind of the background noise over the last few years. And does it in itself become politics as usual and voters just thinking, oh, that's just the usual wrangling between both sides?
The thing to keep in mind is that this is not normal. And people need to constantly remind themselves that this is not normal. This is not how American democracy has or should function. And one of the things that is especially challenging about the way that authoritarianism comes to be in the contemporary era is precisely this element that you mentioned, that people begin to take things for granted or they see it as normal, because it can be very hard to distinguish the real threats from the noise that's out there. Democratic politics is competitive, right? Democracy should be competitive. It's at times boisterous, as the late Senator McCain would say. American democracy is boisterous, but that is different from the things that we talk about in the playbook, and it would be a grave threat to the health of our democracy if our voters and all Americans are not able to recognize and distinguish the difference.
So help me out here. I'm one of many journalists covering this, and we live with this challenge, these challenges you point out every single day. Give me some advice, 3 pointers maybe, for how to not just understand what's going on, but present it to viewers, to readers in a way in which they won't tune out.
Absolutely. So the first thing to do is to identify for yourself, right? How you're going to cover the story. And the fundamental question to that is what you're seeing one of the tactics we talk about in the playbook, or is it not? And if it is, then the question becomes, how big of a deviation from precedent is this? Is this just a continuation of things that we have seen for a long time, or is this something new? Is this sort of losing new ground to this threat? And if it is, in fact, a significant deviation from precedent, the next question then becomes, how prevalent is it? How often is it happening? Is it a one-off isolated event? Or is this something that's starting to happen repeatedly and sort of encroaching in that way? And if the answer to that is yes, then the next question of how to cover it would be, what is the response? In any democracy, we have institutions, we have organizations, we have people in the system who, if all is well, will sort of quash these authoritarian moves and these authoritarian threats. The system will respond and contain that threat. When the system no longer does that, when institutions are no longer able to be independent in order to sort of set the boundary lines, when political parties no longer sort of check that behavior, but instead enable it, those are the types of systemic threats that all of the experts we talked to pointed out to us as being the point at which voters should be really very concerned, especially concerned about what's going on.
Well, then I'll remind folks that the Republican Party of Arizona is no longer a check on that kind of behavior and hasn't been for a while now. And going to the voters themselves, they're going about their day. They look at gas prices, they're high, grocery bills going up. They're concerned about the things that affect them. You talked about authoritarianism. That's a really abstract idea. How do you help them understand what they're seeing, the disinformation they're seeing, the lies, and how they should, conduct themselves?
Yeah. Well, the thing I think actually that we're seeing now is that it's not an entirely abstract idea for people. If you look at the polling, a significant number of Americans, the majority of Americans in many cases, are very deeply concerned about the health of our democracy. And if you look at other research, Americans do have views and values that, in general, are broadly compatible and favor democracy. The problem comes in because, as you said, people have a lot of things to worry about. There are a lot of challenges facing our communities and our country and facing everyone as individuals. The problem is that what the research shows is that when you mix all of these issues together, when you ask people to choose, or don't even ask them to make a deliberate choice, but present a tacit choice between fundamental pieces of democracy, of the system and how it makes it work, and you mix that in with all of the other issues that people care about, they won't always necessarily be able to distinguish the two. And because all of those other concerns are so important, sometimes we'll see those democracy issues become a political football. So for voters, my recommendation to them is to very thoughtfully consider these issues. If you're worried about the health of democracy, think about it as democracy. Think about the fundamentals of our system. Using a framework, we offer one at Protect Democracy in the Authoritarian Playbook that we think is pretty comprehensive. But having a standard like that against which to evaluate all of the things that you see in the news or what you see happening in your community or in your state or in our country, having a framework like that you can evaluate what you see against is a really important first step.
All right. Jennifer Dresden, thanks so much for the work you do, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.